Hi, my name is Daria Mezentseva and welcome to Politeka World Show. In today's show, we will talk about the following. Ukraine can win the war, but the cost may be too high for the West. With such headlines, the week started. Does pressure grow on Ukraine? Can the US afford a second Afghanistan? The prisoner exchange between Russia and US. What does it mean for the war in Ukraine? Are there any signs from Russia to push any bargains with the US? Do fierce claims to Crimea highlight slim chance of Russia-Ukraine peace deal? Ukraine steps up diplomacy amid fighting power outrages. What results can Ukrainians expect for? We will talk about it with our expert. With us today is the chief editor of Kyiv Post, political analyst, journalist, historian, diplomat. So I could tell a lot about this person. It's Bohdan Nahaylo. Bohdan, I am happy to have you here on my show.
I'm very pleased to be on your show finally. Thank you.
Yes, so let's start from the situation around G7. So we know that G7 is holding on this week. What could you tell about the possible decisions during this summit for Ukraine, for the things around the war and around the supply of new weapons, generators, so on and so on?
Quite simply, it's important because it confirms the ongoing support from the G7 and from the democratic countries for Ukraine. But specifically, these meetings, this summit is focusing on reconstruction, on rebuilding Ukraine, helping it to recover. I myself was in London 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, where there was a very big meeting on reconstruction, rebuilding with all the major banks and financial actors taking place. Such events have taken place in many other countries, Poland last Friday, for example, Thursday in Rzeszów. There's a lot of discussion going on right now. What happens when the war ends, when Ukraine wins? What will be needed to help Ukraine not just rebuild its infrastructure, not just to rebuild its roads and damaged generators, etc., but to help the country really restore itself as a modernized country that's not only recovered, but has rebuilt and renewed itself. I think the emphasis is on renewed. And I think that the major challenge here, apart from winning the war and hence the need for weapons and continuing support in that department, is the scale of the undertaking. When I was in London listening to the top experts from the banks a week and a half ago, they were saying that we are no longer talking about 300, 500, 600 billion dollars. We are talking of over $1 trillion. So this is a huge undertaking. It's the largest single financial undertaking, joint undertaking in history so far. It's far larger than the Marshall Plan itself. And relative to that, it's much grander in scale. And this, of course, poses major challenges. Major challenges to get the money, to get countries, banks, private investors to commit, but for Ukraine also to ensure transparency, governance, lack of corruption, credibility, and to work together so that this money is absorbed in a rational manner and is put to the most effective, best use. And so this is part of the discussion that the G7 is engaged in too.
And recently, the counselor of the office of the president of Ukraine, Arestovich, told in one of the interviews that after the war will be won by Ukrainians, by Ukrainian army, it could be even harder time for Ukraine, in relations with Russia. So he told that Russia could start another wave of its aggression. How do you think how G7 could help to prepare to such possible situation around the war?
Well, it's not really the G7's call. Symbolically, yes, but it's really NATO and the capitals of the big countries, Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and others. At the end of the day, for the huge amount of investment to come in, there has to be security and there has to be an end to the war. And for there to be an end to the war, realistically at this stage, this means Russia being defeated, because otherwise nobody is going to invest billions of dollars into a precarious situation with an unknown, uncertain future. If investors believe that tomorrow or 6 months down the road, Russia is going to step up its or renew its attacks on Ukraine, they're not going to invest. So there is, on the one hand, for the capitals and for NATO countries, there is the commitment to help Ukraine actually win, to force Russia into retreating, reparations, war crimes being investigated, etc. And for Russia to accept its place in the international scheme of things as a game player, not as a spoiler and not as a predator attacking other countries. So I think we've got to the stage in the last months where this is clearly understood, even in capitals like Bonn and Paris, that Russia has to be put in its place. And to be put in its place, it has to suffer a defeat which will not only have military implications, but will impact on the Russian population and make it rethink about whether imperialism and autocracy is best for it for the future.
Yeah, so not allow Russia to fight one more time Ukraine and to expand its aggression. So let's talk a little bit about one more news. I was interested in this weekend. We could hear about exchange between Russia and US. I mean, the Kremlin pushed for more than a decade to get Viktor Bout convicted in 2011, and in its return, US got an American basketball star, Brittany Griner. So, as we know, for US, such exchanges are really important. And Bohdan, what do you read in this exchange?
I don't read too much into it. Let's not exaggerate it. The Americans wanted their sportswoman back. The Russians were interested in getting back a figure implicated in, arms dealing, corruption, etc., but who has already been in prison for a long time. So it's not as if there's something new that is going to emerge from this person if he was to be held for longer in American prisons. But symbolically, I suppose, in the sense of getting their own back, we don't forget our own people. That was probably important for the domestic public. For the Americans, it was important to get back a woman that was popular and who seems not to have committed any crime by Western standards and to have been framed. So I think that's on the margins of everything else. It doesn't really impact on the main flow of things. I think what's more important is, discussions like President Zelensky's phone call this weekend with President Biden, the statements being made in Washington.
Bogdan, we will talk about it. But the prisoner, Viktor Bout, had been in prison for a decade, for more than a decade. Yeah. So why U.S. decided to do it right now, at the end of the year, and so on?
Look, you've said yourself, he spent almost 10 years in prison. What else? He's been punished. It could have been longer. But what use was there for America to keep him in prison when they could get back a popular figure, a sportswoman, in exchange? I think it made perfect sense for them to do that. If the arms dealer had been arrested just a week ago or 2 weeks ago and they had let him off scot-free, then we could raise serious questions about what was behind it. But right now, I think it was convenient for America, and even I think it was very expedient for America to get back their citizen without really a great cost, because due process had been done. The person had been sentenced, had served a long sentence already. Why not exchange for somebody who was innocent?
Yeah, and today was published a good article on Kyiv Post about with the title "Does Pressure Can Grow on Ukraine?" So let's discuss it. There was told about the possible protests in Europe in February 2023. Where did you get this information, and how plausible are the protests? Who will be on these protests?
Look, the author is a very respected human rights figure, author Aaron Rhodes. He's very well connected among civil society groups in Europe. And he wrote this summarizing the kind of mood that is being generated, particularly by leftist circles. Leftists, we know, under whose influence they've traditionally been.
Yeah.
This is not something surprising. The Moscow is working very hard behind the scenes to cash in on, to exploit the unhappiness of people in Europe with the sacrifices they have to make because of the cuts in energy that was coming to a large extent from Russia through gas pipelines, oil, etc. And so they are playing on this to say, well, why should you be suffering for a local conflict? This is something for Russians and Ukrainians to sort out. Why should you Europeans be suffering? And unfortunately, there are people who are either ignorant or cynical who buy into this, and they can be manipulated by activists who tell them that, look, this is a war that doesn't affect us. We shouldn't be concerned that cities are being bombed and thousands of civilians killed. We want to live a comfortable life here and be separate from all of that. So I think that this tendency will grow. It will peak round about February, and these demonstrations in Germany are expected to take place, I think, on the 15th of February, if I'm not mistaken. But we can expect this to happen in other countries, in France, in Spain, and elsewhere. It doesn't mean that they will have much impact and influence things, but there will be an attempt to exploit discontent, dissatisfaction, anger even, that there is not the amount of heating or electricity or whatever it is, depending on the country, that they have been used to.
Bohdan, we know that as in Europe, as in US, Russia has its potential political influence. Will these protests be financed by Russia, or will it be the paid protest? How do you think? Because now, as I could see, Macron and Scholz, they do everything to make the situation in the country calm and don't allow these protests to hold on in their countries.
Look, it's a complicated situation, not just because of the war in Russia's war against Ukraine. There are economic difficulties and challenges in the Western countries, and even in Britain, for example. There are many strikes going on, not necessarily anyway connected with Russia's war against Ukraine. But I think here the emphasis of the organizers, who will be very, very careful not to be seen to be taking Russian money, because that's toxic these days. It will be done far more discreetly than before, because I think they are being monitored by security services in the respective countries that we're talking about. I think that there will be an attempt to both play on that dissatisfaction and say we shouldn't really be concerned about the war. But the major thing, and this is what I think the message that leftist intellectuals, right-wing intellectuals, critics of Washington will be pushing is, let's get Ukraine to agree to negotiations. We don't want this war to continue. It's in nobody's interest. Let's force Ukraine to the negotiating table and let's get this over with. Let's get them to concede. This is exactly what Putin wants. And we hear these voices throughout Europe and even in Washington in recent articles in the most respected newspapers.
So we could tell that the Yellow Vests could be back, for example, in France. Yeah, but how do you feel? Do you find that these protests could bring to any pressure, growing pressure on Ukraine, on Ukrainian president, government, and so on?
The pressure will be there, and behind the scenes, it may already be there. From certain leaders, and publicly these messages are being expressed by some politicians, and I've told you we see this in influential newspapers, in op-ed columns, even some politicians and military strategists saying this, that it's time now to to find
but
a
it's
compromise.
not united. It's not united statement about this. We could hear it from one side of the voice, from another side of the voice in America and Europe. But for example, the last Blinken's interview, if you was listening to it, yeah, he told that they won't do anything without Ukraine. Yeah. Maybe we could not believe it, but we could hear these statements as well.
Well, the point is that you have to differentiate between voices in a democratic society who are allowed to express their points of view, even if we don't like them, right? And the official line expressed by President Biden, Blinken, and the others. Likewise, in the other capitals of, that are supporting Ukraine. So I think Zelensky is well aware of this. I think there's a reaction to his statement to the summit in Bali, where he outlined a program for ending the war. And this is now being attacked by Moscow's sympathizers and supporters as unrealistically maximalist. For example, the latest attacks have been focusing on Crimea. How do you expect Russia to compromise if you're not going to allow them to keep Crimea? Or, look, Boris Johnson is a great friend of Ukraine, wonderful. And he had an article in the Wall Street Journal. But I think that there was one slip up in that article, because he said, look, no compromises. This is not the time to talk with Russia. It would mean Ukraine's capitulation. But he again mentioned return to the borders, to the boundaries of February of this year, which means what? The part of eastern Ukraine and Crimea remain with Russia. I mean, we are saying from the point of view of the president and the nation that if we're fighting now to the end, we're fighting for our very survival, then we're fighting for our whole country. We're not prepared to make compromises just to suit Moscow, because they need some face-saving, outcome to have justified the thousands that have been killed on their side, never mind our side, far more on their side. I mean, the military. So I think we can expect more of this.
But Bohdan, do you expect from US that White House is ready to help Ukraine to back the territories what Ukraine had in 1991?
Look, they are committed to this. Let's remember that before this war was intensified in February, there was the ULSA platform, right? And all of these big states were committed to Crimea returning under the control of Ukraine. That was very clear. Nobody's reneged on that. And also the occupation of eastern parts of eastern Ukraine was never recognized. So nobody's actually said, no, that's beyond any discussion. Let's leave it to Russia.
What is the reason of these talks that we are concentrated? I mean, that U.S. representatives told us that they are committed right now to back the territories which Ukraine lost from 24th February. Maybe there are some games with Russia to not allow the escalation, the different statements about nuclear war and so on. Do you observe something like that?
That's possible. I think that, in reserve, the card that Western countries have is return to the positions of February 2022, yeah? But I think that's just one card as a fallback position. The argument will be, well, let's give Moscow some kind of face-saving way out of this situation, otherwise they will not deal. But if Ukraine is successful in its military campaign with the strong support of its allies and with the weaponry and finances it's receiving, there's no reason why they should keep hold of these territories. After all, for Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult to accept Russia again, living with a Russia that's occupying at this moment about 20% of Ukrainian territory. If they win back another 10% and even 10%, how psychologically can Ukraine agree to this? And let
Ukrainians, the main thing, not Ukraine, but Ukrainians couldn't agree with it.
Well, I mean, Ukraine. What is Ukraine? It's Ukraine.
Okay.
I mean, and look, and this, what is very important, I think, in this war, and what has been shown is that it's Eastern Ukrainians, Southern Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, by and large, who have proved themselves such patriots, who have sacrificed their lives, for Ukraine, and they've changed, I think, even the understanding of Ukraine, not only externally, but because we were always projected as a society split in two by language, by religion, etc. But now I think this cohesive political nation, Ukraine, has emerged, democratic, European. And I think that also is a challenge internally for us to review what is modern Ukraine, what is the political nation called Ukraine, how will we rebuild it in an inclusive manner, not anymore exclusive.
Yeah, but I know that you now, Bohdan, in Spain, in Europe, and what I could hear from my friends who are now in Europe and have been to Europe the last year, and they told me Europeans don't understand the real situation in Ukraine. So what we could hear, what we could tell right now to Europeans who live in the Central Europe, because as I know, Eastern Europe, they understand this awareness of responsibility. But what we could tell about Central or West Europe, they are like, this war isn't our war at all, and so on and so on. So what we could tell to Europeans right now, Bohdan, to make them more responsible, that they should also fight for European part of the land, yeah? So I mean Ukraine, so they don't allow them to go out and protest. Could we do it?
Look, I think you have to also differentiate between those who make policy decisions and make opinion, and the rank and file who may be interested or are often disinterested. Look, I'm in Barcelona at the moment, and I have to tell you that, there are people that are not interested. They've never been interested in politics. They've never been interested in Spanish or Catalan politics. But in the cafe across the road from me, in all the newspapers every day. In the main newspapers here, I would say 2 or 3 pages every day are preoccupied with Ukraine and the situation in the war. And people ask me all the time, what's the latest? What's happening? And when I go to Ukraine, when I come back, it's always the same. So I don't think we need to overemphasize that there is disinterest. There is a great deal of sympathy, more than Ukraine has ever had in its history, an awareness of Ukraine as a nation and that Ukraine is different from Russia. We have broken through that barrier this year, because before that, even in 30 years of independence, a lot of people, well, Russians, Ukrainians, what's the difference? Belarusians, all the same. But now they realize that, there is a huge difference. And I think we have obtained that sympathy, understanding, and support. And there's a bar downstairs from me, and the owner, in the early days of the war, donated 500 euros himself, and then put on his menus blue and yellow flags and all of that. Not far from me, there are barriers on the road to prevent cars parking. Blue and yellow, are they being painted?
But
there's a lot of sympathy.
There is
let's
difference
not
between
it.
sympathy and the real steps. Meanwhile, you told me 5 minutes ago that Europeans are ready to come out and protest and to tell that they would like ceasefire.
Daria, not all Europeans. We're talking about those, a particular sort, leftists in particular, and those manipulated by them. That's not everybody. That's not a majority. There will always be these groups that will be doing that in any situation. So let's not exaggerate. But I gave an example. By the way, the leftist intellectual, the guru of the left that I mentioned before, was Noam Chomsky.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, the most famous figure in the West that supposed the Western policies, right? Anyway, let's also look critically at Ukrainians. Have we always supported others when we had a chance? I look at Belarus. Did we do much to support the Belarusian revolution 3 or 4 years ago when it was crushed so brutally, that peaceful one? And have we expressed much sympathy for them under an occupation, de facto Russian occupation, with a vassal called Lukashenko? No, we look at them as enemies because Russia has based its military forces there. But is it the Belarusian people? Are we extending a hand to them and saying, this is our common fight? With Ukraine's victory, you will also be part of Europe tomorrow, and we sympathize with you.
Yeah, but they didn't have war. They didn't have people died of shellings. They didn't have rockets around the city. So it's a different situation.
No, it's not different. Nor did we at that time. We still deal with Lukashenko. We have not invited, the government has not invited the leader of the opposition to Kyiv, even though she has been received by all the Western leaders, Tikhanovskaya. Why? What is going on behind the scenes? Why do we have this double standards?
What I hear, Bogdan,
this is a government that has recognized an independent Chechnya. It's convenient for us to, recognize Ichkeria as independent. Why don't we say we sympathize with Belarus? You are under occupation. За нашу и вашу свободу, for your freedom and ours. That's the message.
Yeah, but the opposition in Belarus, there are a lot of questions to opposition in Belarus, but it's not the topic of our talk. Yeah. Also, what you started to talk about in the beginning of the interview, the diplomatic context of Ukrainian President Zelensky have been increased during the last week. So, what do you read in this? Do you see that any this diplomatic contacts with Biden, Macron, Erdogan will have any results this week? Should we expect for some good news to help Ukraine? Could it be so quickly?
Look, that's simplifying matters. We have good news constantly. The level of support is very high. Nobody expects dramatic changes overnight or in a week or two. Biden's message to Zelensky was, we keep supporting you, we will support you, etc. Macron tries to deal with Putin, but says, we support you, we'll support you. Scholz, likewise. Scholz is sending some defensive weapons, but refusing to send tanks, but already doing far more than 6 months ago, etc., etc. So I think we have to be realistic and realize that we cannot expect things to just happen suddenly. There is a consistency in the strong support that our friends and now allies are giving us. And I don't think that we can expect something dramatic to change overnight.
Yeah, and the last but not the least, do you observe any, I could tell, pushing of negotiations by Putin? Of ramp talks with US right now. As I know, today in Ukrainian society, a lot of channels talk about it. How do you observe this situation from Europe right now?
Well, of course, Putin will be trying through various channels to say, look, I'm ready to talk.
Or already, Bohdan, will be trying or already trying?
He's already trying since at least September, when he realized that his efforts are blocked, that the Ukrainians have counterattacked, they've retaken Kherson, they're ready to move forward. Heavy weapons are coming in that can strike into Russia. Russia is feeling the impact of these strikes, as we saw in recent days. So, of course, Putin's people want to get as favorable a settlement as possible. I think they realize, whatever the rhetoric is, that they cannot defeat Ukraine. They cannot destroy this country. They cannot wipe it off the face of the earth as an independent nation and state. So what compromise can be reached? I think what they're trying to do is say, okay, we're trying to be reasonable. In between, the lines are, yes, okay, we've learned our lesson. Let's go back to before, etc. But the crucial questions are how to secure for Ukraine not only the territory, but security guarantees for the future, to ensure that Russia is not going to invade when it gets stronger again in 3 years and the West becomes slacker and tired of all of this.
Do you see any possible recipe, Bohdan? Do you see any possible recipes in the air right now for it?
No, I don't. I think the West is very strong, and the messages from the NATO Secretary General, from Biden, from even Scholz, even Macron, certainly London, they're all saying that we cannot and should not try to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, because it's Ukraine's choice, and we are not asking it to capitulate, which conceding at this moment would amount to. So I don't see any dangers of that. The dangers might be if the war drags on for ages and ages, and there will be a natural fatigue, a fatigue that is financial, and also this pressure that we spoke about. It might build up in societies at times of elections that might impact on decision making. But that's in the future. I think if Ukraine can hold its positions and make some advances during a very difficult winter that awaits us, then I think the danger is not as great as perhaps some imagine.
Bohdan, thank you for these fruitful answers. It was really good talk, and I have something to think about after it. And I love it when I could could think about something after the interview. Thank you for your time. Thank you for supporting Ukraine, for everything you're doing in Kyiv Post and in all your work time, because we need it. We need it and we appreciate it. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you to be with us. And don't forget to be subscribed to YouTube channel Politeka World and leave comments to be in the heart of the most important things about Ukraine.